So Tenet Employee Benefit Solutions can help employers in a number of ways. Firstly, we've got a long-standing experience of employee benefits in general. We're pensions specialists and now we're experts in auto enrolment. We've dealt with a number of organisations to help meet their auto enrolment duties. We understand the challenges that face those organisations and found solutions to meet those challenges. The key parts of auto enrolment is design, implementation and run. And we can help employers all the way through those processes in a holistic approach. Alternatively, we can help employers fill in the gaps, the resources and expertise they have in order to fulfil their auto enrolment duties. We can help with providing advice about existing pension schemes, with your communication strategy, putting all the various constituent parts that will enable you to have a successful outcome for auto enrolment. Not only at the beginning, but also ongoing management. We have software system which we can put in place to help your organisation, to help coordinate the various parts of your payroll, pension provider and HR. We can provide governance duties to help you meet the standards that are going to be required of employers when they have their pension scheme in place. More importantly, I think, it is complex, but we can make it simple for you. It can be costly, but we can look at ways of reducing that cost. And it can involve a large amount of resources and time. And I think we can help reduce those resources that you have to commit and therefore the time that you have to commit to auto enrolment and really sort of get on with your normal everyday business. We can help you evaluate and assess the key constituent parts that you'll need to put in place and coordinate. Existing pension schemes, the pension provider that you'll require, the software system that you'll need to coordinate the pension provider and how the payroll system can best coordinate with that software system. So with us, we can provide you all the services that you need to have a successful auto enrolment outcome. Well, auto enrolment's been with us now since 2012, so it's been evolving as different types of companies have reached their staging date. Current situation in 2014, in fact, there'll be nearly 40,000 companies staging in 2014, and that just gets larger and larger in 2015 and subsequent years. Situation last year with clients was that it was very much an education process. They were getting to grips with actually what the legislation meant and how to understand it. Now we're finding with the 2014 market, which is roughly, well, we're now in the situation where it's sort of 250 employees and less, down to 50 at the end of the year, where actually clients are aware of exactly what they've got to do and there's a sense of urgency. So it's very much a case of understanding what the costs are going to be, how are they going to prepare and what services do they need. We're also finding that there's a change with providers in the marketplace as well. Prior to auto enrolment, the group pensions market seemed to be fairly stable with a steady number of suppliers in that marketplace. What we're finding now is that the traditional providers are in fact very much cherry picking the schemes they want. This is really important that clients understand that they will actually have to be prepared to look around for a provider, and it might not be the traditional pensions provider that they might be aware of. It might well be Nest or People's Pension or other master trusts that are available out there. We're also seeing the need for planning and expertise to help them through the legislation and understand exactly what's required of them. Well, I think the thing about auto enrolment is that from first pass it can seem that actually it isn't very complicated at all. You essentially need to assess your staff at a certain time, and for particular types of staff you need to pay over a contribution within a specified time period. The reality is actually when you look at what is involved with auto enrolment, that it is actually much more complicated than you might think, and this is something which is causing some problem in the marketplace because actually it requires a large amount of time to in fact plan for auto enrolment and get the company in place. I think the best way to think about it from a company's point of view and maybe also from an advisor's point of view is that auto enrolment is really a compliance function of the company. So in the same way that the company pays their PAYE, national insurance or VAT, in fact now paying into a pension scheme for their employees is in fact another part of their ordinary compliance function before they even make their first widget, say. So from that point of view, companies have got to decide how they're going to deal with that. Are they going to deal with it in-house, outsource some, or in fact outsource all of it? And these are the major points to get across to your clients when you're talking to them. I mentioned that the planning time can seem longer than first perceived. For 2012 and 2013 stages, it was commonly perceived that it was 12 to 18 months, the planning period for auto enrolment. That's probably true still now, especially if you've got some parts of the organisation that are more complex than others. But typically for SMEs, I'd say 6 months is certainly the point at which you need to start really looking at auto enrolment for your organisation. The reason why is because not only is the pension regulator provide a large amount of detail to understand and digest, but also because it affects various parts of the organisation. You might have an existing pension scheme in place, well that will need to be reviewed. You might need to talk to the provider there to understand whether they'll accept that scheme as an auto enrolment scheme. Also, the key point is data and payroll. You need to look at your payroll systems and how well they can adapt with the requirements and duties that you have as an employer. There may be HR effects as well. So you might need to look at your terms and conditions of employment. Certainly, you'll need to look at how those systems, the payroll system and the HR systems, can talk to the pension provider and how that exchange of data can happen. It's complex, and the proof of that really is that if you look at the Pensions Regulator latest report, there are over 500 enforcement notices from the regulator about areas where there have been miscompliance. And you've got to combine that with the fact that the regulator has some quite serious fines available to them. You know, for instance, companies that stage at the moment, £2,500 a day is, from the date of the breach, is in fact the fine they could be levied. They haven't levied any at the moment, but you can see that just from the fact that there are 500 enforcement notices investigations in place, that in fact companies are finding it very difficult to meet all the requirements the legislation require. The pension regulator has set out 8 stages that companies need to follow in order to meet their auto enrolment requirements. We've set out 8 stages but slightly modified those to incorporate what we think are probably more understandable in terms of making sure that all the resources are in place and you follow things logically. The first stage in the process is to identify your staging date. Every company is given a staging date by the pensions regulator, and this will be communicated to them, usually by post, 12 months before the staging date. The staging date has been calculated by the number of employees in the company as at April 2012, but it will also be referenced to their PAYE reference number. At staging date, an employer must have a qualifying workplace pension scheme in place for its staff. It's important that it meets certain requirements of the legislation, and this is why it's called a qualifying workplace pension scheme. This means that it must have a certain level of contributions, it must have a certain type of investment fund, it must allow auto-enrolment of employees into that scheme. You may have an existing pension scheme in place for your staff. It's important to understand whether this is a qualifying pension scheme or not, and whether modifications can be made. If they can't, then you will have to look at a new pension scheme for your employees. One of the main parts of the legislation requires an employer to assess their workforce each time they pay their employees. What this means is that each employee will be put into a category by virtue of how much they earn in that period and their age. Each category of employee will have a different treatment in terms of contributions, communications they receive, and also how they're monitored going forward. And this is a key requirement of the auto enrolment legislation that employers are finding very difficult to set up. Once you've assessed your employees, you'll know which category under the legislation the employees will actually go into. For those employees that meet certain requirements by virtue of their age and salary, they'll be auto-enrolled into the pension scheme. For those that don't, they'll need to be treated in a different way. In fact, each category will require a different communication strategy, which will need to be supplied by a certain date in order to meet the employer duties. As you're probably beginning to understand, all these systems and processes that are required under the legislation are not easy to perform unless you have a robust IT system to back your duties up. Payroll is where it all starts. That's where the assessment starts, and that's where the data is produced to drive all the actions from that point. So IT is really key here. IT in terms of your payroll software, and IT in terms of the pension provider software, and also how that matches up. And what we're seeing is the reliance on certain systems, typically called middleware, which join the data from payroll into the pension provider and also drives that communications, the record keeping, and to make sure that you are actually meeting your employer duties. Because there are so many different elements that have to tie in and coordinate with each other, not only within the employer's organisation, but also outside of the organisation, that in fact it's really important that you make sure that you test the processes before you actually go live. You don't want to find out that actually the data that's produced from the payroll system doesn't actually quite match the pension provider's requirements. So we would suggest that the test process is a key stage within your auto enrolment readiness. So we've tested the processes, you understand what your communication strategy is, you have your pension provider in place, and you've assessed your staff, and it's time to press the button. So it's important to understand exactly what does happen at this point. For all those people who've become eligible employees, they will be auto-enrolled, and what that means is they will receive a deduction in their payslip in that month. They'll receive a communication from you to say that they have been auto-enrolled and the deduction will be made, and shortly after that they'll receive a pack from the pension provider saying that they have a pension scheme with them. It will tell them about the pension scheme, but also will tell them how to opt out of that pension scheme if they want to. If the employee decides they don't want to be in the pension scheme, they need to complete the opt-out process, which is detailed in the pack from the pension provider. The opt-out goes to the pension provider, who then communicates that back to the employer, who in the next pay reference period, or the pay period of the employee, they administer a refund of contributions to the employee, and in fact to the employer as well. So you've set your scheme up, you've assessed your workforce, you've put your communication strategy in place, you've got your software in place, and you're making contributions to the pension provider and dealing with opt-outs. These processes have to be replicated every time you pay your workforce. And these are your compliance and ongoing requirements and duties under the legislation. The second part surrounds governance. You've put your pension scheme provider in place. What we're seeing from the regulator and other authorities is, in fact, there is becoming an increasing onus on the company to make sure that the pension scheme they've put in place and the default fund that most of the employees will be going into is in fact fit for purpose. So you'll need to regularly review those items. Well, auto enrolment has been with us since October 2012. We can see a pattern of the major challenges that organisations face when they're trying to meet their auto enrolment duties. The first one is really trying to understand the legislation. The regulator provides an excellent website. It has a project planner in there as well, so you can see the sort of timelines that they suggest. The information and guidance that goes with that is over 250 pages, which can be quite impenetrable to somebody who doesn't necessarily understand pensions and, in fact, the legislation as a whole. But it is important you understand this legislation, because once you understand it, you understand what options that are available to your organisation and which best fit your circumstances. Once you understand what options are best for you, you can then understand the impacts on the organisation in terms of costs and also the need to assess your resources both in-house and external. Communications is proving problematic. not because of the volume and varied types of communications there are, but also the fact of the logistics of delivering those communications. Not every company has all its employees on one site with work email addresses. Companies may find that they have employees all over the UK, some with email addresses, some without. However, the communications need to get through in a timely fashion to each of those employees. Communication is one thing, but also making sure the staff understand exactly what's going to happen. So they understand that they will be assessed in a certain date, they will have a deduction from their pay slip if they are eligible employees, and a way in which they opt out, which doesn't mean they contact the employer. So communication strategy is key. Communications and making sure the employees really understand what's happening and what's involved in the communications is also key. The last challenge, I call it the E word, and the E word stands for everything. I think it's important to understand that the legislation is potentially complex. It does require various parts of your organisation to be involved in the project plan. It will require external organisations to be involved, the payroll provider, the pension provider, and also maybe software provider as well. The thing that we increasingly find is that people are coming on to employers and they say, we do everything. And that lulls the employer into maybe a false sense of security. What they mean by everything is they maybe look after everything regarding the pension scheme. They may look after everything regarding the software. But really everything under the legislation is much wider than that. It starts with understanding the legislation, as I said before. It really means designing your scheme to fit your organisation's objectives and resources. Once you can do that, then you can employ help from pension organisations, software organisations, payroll organisations to fulfil your strategy and your objectives. So everything is a wider brief than maybe you suspect, and understanding what that wider brief is will help you understand exactly what services you are getting from your advisors and organisations that are there to help you. I think one of the key myths that we see is that employers think that they can delay their staging date for up to 3 months. And this is actually a complete misconception. The staging date is the staging date, and you have to be ready for auto enrolment in terms of setting up your pension scheme and have various constituent parts in place for your staging date. Postponement is something where you can delay the assessment of your workforce for up to 3 months. So at staging date, you need to have your pension scheme in place. You should be ready to assess your workforce, but you don't have to do that for up to 3 months after the staging date. Another myth that we see is companies that maybe have an existing pension scheme in place for their staff and think that actually that will do. The problem here is that we've seen before, and I've mentioned that actually not all pension providers will be taking on auto enrolment schemes. So it's really important that you liaise with your existing pension provider to make sure that they will actually facilitate the scheme being a qualifying workplace pension scheme to fulfil your auto enrolment duties. The problem here is that from a pension company's point of view, they don't see all your staff. You may have monthly or management staff in the pension scheme. The actual demographic of your company may be totally different, and that will influence as to whether a pension provider will actually be willing to take on your scheme to auto-enroll the whole of the staff. And certainly where you've got a mix of monthlies and weeklies, we're seeing a common and a frequent response in that, yep, well, we don't mind taking on the monthlies, we can be a scheme for them, but for the weekly staff, I'm afraid you'll have to find somewhere else. So again, it could be quite problematic if you have got an existing scheme. The key thing is to engage with the pension provider very early to understand exactly what they will do and what they won't do. So then you can actually assess your options from there on. One of the immediate responses we get from employers that we talk to about auto enrolment is that most of the staff will opt out. Most of the staff can't afford a pension scheme, and most of the staff will therefore decide that they won't be involved. That goes against the evidence that we've seen coming from 2012. Opt-out rates have been extremely low, typically 10%, maybe even less. We've seen with our own clients, both monthly and weekly staff, that actually the opt-out rates are extremely low. Even when they've been offered a company pension scheme beforehand and turned that down, we're seeing involvement rates of over 50% of that particular part of the workforce. So I think our message would be to expect a higher involvement from the employees than you would consider at first glance, and therefore budget accordingly. When we talked about employer duties, one of the things was assess your workforce. And I think the difference here is workforce. So a lot of employers think they have to assess only their employees. In fact, workforce means anybody who's actually working for the company and is in receipt of some remuneration, whether that be through an invoice or through pay. If someone's self-employed, the HMRC categorisation of self-employed might well be sufficient. It's not being challenged. But under the pensions reform legislation, that self-employed person might actually be a worker and therefore will need to be assessed. So don't just think about the employees that you on your payroll. Extend that to other people that you engage for services. The key thing is working out exactly whether they're a worker or within the legislation or not. If they are, they will need to be assessed and you will need to deal with them accordingly. Another common conversation we have with clients, especially smaller employers, is that in fact the legislation doesn't apply to them because it applies only to larger companies. It's important to set out two things. Firstly, it is all companies. The legislation does actually start with the larger companies in October 2012. We're presently in the period where it's sort of 50 employees plus. And next year it'll be the micro employers. But it is every employer that will be involved in auto enrolment and have to meet duties. And again, when you back that up with some of the fines that the regulator has at their disposal, it's very important to be aware that you do have to meet your employer duties and understand exactly what that timescale is.